Hello, everyone. Professor Benavides here. Let's continue talking about Chapter 9, classes. Specifically, let's drill down on working with classes and instances. So the question is posed, how can you work with classes and instances? You can use classes to represent many real-world situations. Once you write a class, you'll spend most of your time working with instances created from that class. One of the first tasks you'll want to do is modify the attributes associated with a particular instance. You can modify the attributes of an instance directly or write methods that update attributes in specific ways. So that's what we're going to be drilling down on this particular section. Before we do that, let's go ahead and look at the car class. And here you have it. Let me go ahead and run it right away so we can make sure I've got the right file up here. And if you're looking at the screen here, you'll see on line 3, I have my class definition. I'll expand and collapse it. And then I have my instantiation occurring on line 18. And then on line 19, I go ahead and call a method called getDescriptiveName. So let's drill down on this. So this class will store information about the kind of car we're working with, and it will have a method that summarizes this information. At the top of the car class, we define the init method with the self parameter first, just like we did before with our dog class. We also give it 3 other parameters: make, model, and year. The init method takes these parameters and assigns them to the attributes that will be associated with instances made from this class. When we make a new car instance, we'll need to specify a make, model, and year for our instance. We define a method called get_descriptive_name that puts a car's years, make, and model into one string, neatly describing a car. This will spare us from having to print each attribute's value individually. To work with the attribute values in this method, we use self.make, self.model, and self.year. Lastly, we make an instance of the car class and assign it to the variable my_new_car. We then call get_descriptive_name to show what kind of car we have. So here we have it right here. Here's the class definition. We see on line 4, I've got my doc string. Of course, I start off with the keyword class. The name of the class is car, and followed by a colon. So inside I have my init method and one other method called getDescriptiveName. So what happens here is that when I get to line 18, on line 18, this is where we instantiate an object. And I pass Audi A4 2019. So Audi pops into make, A4 pops into model, and year goes in, and 2019 goes into year. So each one of those are then assigned to self.make, self.model, and self.year. Those become the instance variables, right? So then we have this special method here that, as you know, all methods inside of the class must have the self parameter, even though when you call it, you don't pass the self parameter. It is the instance itself. Okay, so the self parameter represents the instance itself. So when I instantiate the object on line 18, then I create my instance variables. They're populated into Audi A4 2019. And then on line 19, I go ahead and call getDescriptiveName, and that will then create a formatted string, and it puts it in a variable called long name, and it's returned. So here we have a method that returns a value to the place from which it's called. So that gives us 2019 Audi A4. Why? Because the formatted string shows us the year, the make, and the model number. Okay, so this is a very good, I think, a very good example of working with classes and instances. We've got the class definition starting on line 3, and we've got the instance on line 18, and then we go ahead and call a method of that particular object by using dot notation. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to our next topic here, which is setting a default value for an attribute. And that's done just to get to the chase, cut to the chase, as they say. It's the same car definition, class definition. We just added this line 11, which is self.odometer underscore reading gets 0. We set the default value for an attribute on line 11. Then we have the same old get descriptive name method that we saw before, and we add this read odometer method. Okay, so let me go ahead and run this. So on line 22, I go ahead and create my instance or my object, right? And I pass it Audi A4 2019. Then I call the descriptive method using dot notation, object dot method, and I get to the new factor here, which is line 24, my underscore new car dot read odometer. We call the method called read odometer, and what does it do here? It goes over here to read odometer, and it accesses the instance variable that was set to 0 upon instantiation. So self.odometer was set to 0. We have set the default value for an attribute, and we accessed it by means of a method. So this is an example of setting a default value for an attribute. Remember, the attributes are what's inside of the init method. It's our data, it's our information, and our behavior for this class comes from the methods, right? So we add this attribute. This is the kind of attribute that can change over time. We'll add an attribute that stores the car's overall mileage. That's the odometer reading, right? So this time, when Python calls the init method to create a new instance, it stores the make, model, and year values as attributes like it did in the previous example. Then Python creates a new attribute called odometer underscore reading and sets its initial value to 0. We also have a new method called read underscore odometer that makes it easy to read the car's mileage. So let's go ahead and talk now about modifying these attributes, right? We set a default value. Let's talk about modifying these default attributes. So let me go ahead and run this so we won't have the information from before. And so modifying attribute values, how can you change an attribute's value? You can change an attribute's value in 3 ways. You can change the value directly through an instance. You can set the value through a method, or increment the value, that is, add a certain amount to it through a method. So we're going to learn about incrementing here. Incrementing is typically introduced when we talk about loops and stuff like that, but it's good to go ahead and see that we can be incrementing inside the method as well. So let's talk about modifying an attribute's value directly. So how is that done? Where is that magic occurring on this code? That magic, just to cut to the chase, is occurring on line 25. So it's object dot odometer underscore reading gets 23. We are modifying an attribute's value directly. So as you can see here, the object is called my underscore new underscore car. Then I use the dot notation to access the attribute called odometer reading. See this right here? Odometer reading currently, upon instantiation, was set to a default of 0. But then what happens here on line 25 is I am modifying the attribute's value directly by assigning 23 to it. So when I go ahead and do line 26, where we call the read odometer method of the object, it goes and shows me what the current value is. And you know what the current value would be 23 because we modified it directly. Okay. So we use dot notation to access a car's odometer reading attribute and set its value directly. This line tells Python to take the instance my underscore new underscore car, find the attributes odometer underscore reading associated with it, and set the value of that attribute to 23. That's happening right here on my line 25, right? So let's talk about modifying an attribute's value through a method. So see, this is how you would access it directly. Let's contrast that with accessing it through a method. Go ahead and run that. We're getting the same stuff, but we're doing it in a different way. So basically, it's the same init method. We've got the same descriptive method, the same odometer reading method. What's new here is that so let me go ahead and collapse some of this so that, so that, because we don't really need to see it. We already know what's inside the init method. We've already understand the get descriptive name, and I do like get in front of methods. And then, why didn't they say get odometer reading? But anyway, odometer reading, well, we'll leave those two on there. So on line 26, I create my instance, right? Pass it Audi A4 2019. Anybody like Audis? I don't like them. No. I don't know why. But anyway, on line 27, then I go ahead and call the descriptive name. So that's fine. We've already done that. What's new here is line 29. So on line 29, using dot notation, it's object dot update odometer. I pass 23. 23 goes into mileage. Mileage is then assigned to odometer reading. So this is how we update it using a method. And what happens here is that we call read odometer to access the instance variable read odometer reading. We access the instance variables by using the self keyword, because remember, the self keyword, represents the instance, right? So when you run it, I think I did already, we want to make sure we get pretty much the same information. So instead of accessing the attribute directly that we did before, you pass the new value to a method that handles the update internally. I particularly like this method rather than doing it directly, because coming from C++ and Java, that was the way that we were taught to go ahead and do that. This book doesn't talk about private, public, protected, because it doesn't, those words don't have any meaning in Python. So for those of you that know what those words mean, I'll continue to talk about that a little bit, but you may have learned in other languages that it's not okay to access the attributes directly, that you should access them through a method. And there's, it's just a difference, in the way Python handles. So there are no private, public, and protected, instance variables. Okay, so in Python. So the only modification to car is the addition of the update odometer method. This method takes in a mileage value and assigns it to self.odometer underscore reading. We call the update underscore odometer and give it 23 as an argument corresponding to the mileage parameter in the method definition. It sets the odometer reading to 23, and read underscore odometer prints the reading. So how can we extend this method to do some additional work? It's just one little thing that makes it kind of neat. I've collapsed the parts of the program that we don't need to focus on at this time. Let's focus on the update underscore odometer method. It receives mileage, and we just did an F else structure on here. And basically, if what you're wanting to bring in here is greater than or equal to what you already have, then fine, do the update. Else, you'll say, hey, you cannot roll back the odometer. So that's the additional logic that we're adding here. So what we do is on line 33, we instantiate our object, we print out the descriptive name, fine. Then we go to line 36 and we call the update odometer. We pass it 23,500, right? And then we read it. So let me go ahead and run this because I'm still showing the older stuff on here. If you do want to look at any of these other methods here, you just simply expand them and see what the contents are. So it's always a good idea to go ahead and expand and collapse what you don't need to see, so that you can focus on what's important. So when you instantiate this object, it's going to be set to 0, right? So after I assign 23,000, and this is the underscore here is the format that we use for large numbers, so that in your head you can deal with all those zeros and stuff like that. It's 23,500. So it's a pretty neat little feature to have, and how to go ahead and deal with something like that. So that's the additional logic that we're adding here. Okay. So if the new mileage is greater than or equal to the existing mileage, self.odometer underscore reading, you can update the odometer reading to the new mileage. If the new mileage is less than the existing mileage, you get a warning that you can't roll back the odometer, right? So do you want to see this? You can't roll back, because we don't see that on here, right? That's because we don't have an interactive kind of thing, but it's already set to 0, so I would have to make this negative then, right? So let me just put a negative sign on this, and then let's do another run. And then it says you can't roll back the odometer. The car has 0 miles on it. So it goes, since I'm accessing the object dot attribute, the read odometer. Well, the actual read odometer, this is a method here. That's when we call this, we're accessing the attribute through this method. Okay. Since we didn't update it, it didn't allow for the update. So since we didn't allow for the update, it returns 0. So if I get rid of this negative sign here and run it again, we go back to the fact that yes, it was updated. The new mileage that was coming in is assigned to the instance variable called self_odometer_ reading, or self period, excuse me, or dot. It would be the more appropriate way to go ahead and say that. So let's talk about incrementing an attribute's value through a method. Okay, so the new method increment odometer takes in a number of miles and adds this value to the self.odometer_ reading. Okay. Note, a very important note here is that you can use methods like this to control how users of your program update values, such as an odometer reading, but anyone with access to the program can set the odometer reading to any value by accessing the attribute directly. This is related to that concept of private and public that we have in C++ and Java that we don't have in Python. So I invite you to go ahead and read about that. If you go to Stack Overflow, people are discussing that topic in Stack Overflow. I go over that, I believe in Appendix C. Talks about the importance of referring to Stack Overflow, but don't fall into the copy and paste problem that many people fall into here. So effective security takes extreme attention to detail in addition to basic checks like those here. So it's a check. This if, when you use an if, it's a check. Some people call this like validation. You know, it's a very important topic in object-oriented programming, right? So did I? Yeah, I was going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about this little magic, this little if here. The book talks about just writing this one little line of code, and then it said you could easily check for negative number. So I'm going to allow mileage to be updated if it's greater than or equal to 0. Else I'll say you can't roll back. Okay, so like say for example here, we're talking about the increment. We talked about the increment underscore odometer. If I pass it 100, it increments. Let me go ahead and run that. See how it says the car has 23,500, and then it says the car has 23,600 miles on it, right? This is that because we call the object.increment underscore odometer method. We pass 100 to it. 100 goes into miles, and miles is, yes, greater than or equal to 0. But if we pass negative 100, let's go ahead and see what happens here. Then it says the car has 23,500 miles on it. You can't roll back an odometer, and it says again, it repeats the reading again that the car has 23,500 miles on it. So the if test is working on here. So I invite you to go ahead and do these kinds of range checks, validation checks, or whatever you want to go ahead and call them. They're called checks to make sure that the data that it's going into your into the instance variables are reputable and valid and within range. Okay. So now that brings us to the try it yourself. So we go ahead and do something different. Just let's go ahead and bring those up in Visual Studio Code. And 9-4 is called number served. It says start with your program from exercise 9.1. Add an attribute called number underscore served with a default value of 0. Create an instance called restaurant from this class. Print the number of customers the restaurant has served, and then change the value and print it again. It also says add a method called set underscore number underscore served that lets you set the number of customers that have been served. Call this method with a new number and then print the value again. And then it says add another method called increment underscore number underscore served that lets you increment the number of customers who've been served. Call this method with any number you'd like that could represent how many customers were served in, say, a day. So this shares a lot of parallelism to what we've done before, but let's look at the main ideas here. On line 10, we're setting a number served to 0. This is a default value. So then I'm going to go ahead and collapse the describe restaurant because that just simply describes it. That's not the focus of the discussion here. And also I'm going to collapse the open restaurant, which is simply another string that's being created. So I'm going to collapse those two so that we can concentrate on these two methods that are here. We've got the set number served, and this is the one that has been added, and the increment. Okay, and notice the incrementer occurs with the plus equals to. So that on line 31, I create my object called restaurant, and I pass it the mean queen pizza. Then I called describe restaurant, which is fine. So now we get to the magic here. We access on line 34. Notice how I create a formatted string that uses the dot operator to access an attribute value. And we're accessing the default. After we access the default, we go ahead and set the attribute directly by saying object dot method gets 430. Then we simply prove that it has been updated. Then we do the same thing again, but we call the set number served, right? That is a method, and you know we're passing 1257 to it, and then we verify that the attribute was updated. Then we call the incrementer. We increment it by 239, and then we verify that by accessing the attribute directly. So let me go ahead and run this. Oh, I keep doing it like as if I was in Sublime. Let me go ahead and run it over here. Sorry about that. So there we have the default value was 0, and then we practice comparing accessing the attribute directly versus accessing the attribute by means of a method, okay? Or updating the attribute by means of a method. So you can update an attribute directly, or you can update an attribute through a method, and this particular example does that for us. We'll go ahead and look at another one on here. And this other one is 9.5. This is the login attempts. And it says here, add an attribute called login attempts to your user class from exercise 9.3. Write a method called increment underscore login underscore attempts that increments the value of login attempts by 1. Write another method called the reset underscore login underscore attempts that resets the value of login underscore attempts to 0. Make an instance of the user class and call increment underscore login underscore attempts several times. Print the value of login attempts to make sure it was incremented properly. Then call the reset login attempts. Print login attempts again to make sure it was reset to 0. Excellent little idea here. So let's go ahead and look at the class here. I see my init method. Here are my attributes, my instance variables. The last one here sets attempts to 0 by default. Then I describe the user. I greet the user. These are not new ideas, so I'll collapse those. And then we have our incremental login attempts, right? And then we will go ahead and reset. And then we make our instance on line 35. We create our instance, and then we call describe user, greet user. And then here's where the magic occurs here. We're going to call the increment underscore login attempt several times and then call the method to verify. So, okay, so here's what happens. On line 41, I call the method 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. So every time it does that, it's going to increment this incrementer here on line 28. So I should expect to see 3 here, right? If I set this to 0 and I call it 3 times, I should expect to see 3 when I say object.login underscore attempts to see what the value of the login attempts have. Beautiful little program. And then lastly, we reset it. And we do that by calling object.reset underscore login attempts. And then we verify that it was reset. So if you look at the reset method simply assigns 0 to self.login attempts. Really cool idea. Let me go ahead and run this, see what we get. So here it is. Here's the description. And we say we're making 3 attempts. So how many do we have? 3. And then we call the reset method, and then we check to see what's inside of there, and we've got 0. So it's working beautifully. So we've been introduced to a couple little side topics. One of the side topics here is incrementing. This particular one, incrementing by 1, you'll see it a lot in, say, for example, loops and stuff like that. But it increments here every time you go ahead and call the method. Now, this is shorthand. It's self.login underscore attempt plus equals. What's the long version of this? let me go ahead and comment that out, right? And show you what the long version of that is. So the long version of that should look something like this. Let me look at it again. So it's the longhand way to do this would be, let's say it's just a variable, which is it's an instance variable. It would be variable gets variable plus 1. So the first time we come in here, if we had 0, which we had, and you add 1 to it, then it is incremented to 1. The next time we come into this, it's got 1 inside of here. We add 1 to it, it's incremented to 2. Let me verify that this works and I'm not introducing any bugs. And I'm still doing it. So let's run this again. And yes, it's running just fine. Let's go ahead and do the step through on this so that we can, or step into, so that we can verify the logic on this. And I'm going to put a breakpoint right here on the first. Well, I think we only have one instance or one object. So let's go ahead and put a breakthrough on that. And then I'm going to go to run, start debugging, Python file. And I'm going to be pressing F11 to, or you could press this little button that says step into. So and then you'll see the output down below. So if I press F11, it goes into instantiating the object. So it goes directly to the init method, and the init method does its thing and it creates the object. So it comes back to line 36 because, see, on line 36, what it did is it went and put Eric, Mathis, etc. It went and did, it called the init method and it passed these arguments so that we ended up with the instance variables. So that when I call describe user, it has data in it. And see how it goes to the describe user method? Then it comes back over here, right? And comes back to the place where it was called and continues to the next line. So we did line 36, line 37, line 38. So I hope you're seeing the flow of control here. So now we're going to go ahead and call greet user. It goes into greet user and it greets the user. And then now it's going to go and make the temp. So it's going to increment it one time. It's going to go in and increment it another time. And it's going to go ahead and increment it another time. Now, notice how this is the line that's going to get executed, but it hasn't get executed yet. If I point to this variable or this instance variable, it's got 2 in it. So if I add 2 plus 1, as soon as I get off this line, then this instance variable will be updated to 3. Okay. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and see. We're going to print out and notice it's showing you that it's got 3 in there, right? So there we go ahead and print out the login attempts. And then now we're going to go ahead and reset. So it's going to go ahead and call, the reset method. So flow of control goes into the class method, and we're going to assign 0 to login underscore attempts, and it's done. And we're going to go ahead and then print out 0. See how I point to the variable? And we see that it's got 0 in it. And that, my friends, that is the end of this little demonstration, the end of this section on object-oriented programming. We covered, a variety of topics on here, but mostly we talked about working with classes and instances. The main idea of this little section was to learn how to modify the attributes of an instance directly versus writing methods that update attributes in a specific way. We were also introduced to some other concepts like, incrementing variables as well as accumulators that utilized a shorthand abbreviated operator to accumulate or increment. Okay, so basically, just to reiterate, the way that's done is on line 29. If you'll notice, this is the long hand way of doing this, counter, if you would. So what the shorthand way is, you get the plus sign from over here and you put it right in front of the equal sign, and that gives you the ability to get rid of one of these attempts. It's kind of like math. It's kind of like you're canceling out one of these variables by putting the plus sign in front of the equal sign. Okay, so that gives you this syntax above, which I commented. All right, my friends, well, that's all I've got to say about this particular section. I hope you learned a thing or two, and see you in the next video. Bonsoir.